Hi, gang. Been a great day so far. This is, I think, for most people, their first hybrid event, right? And I think it's been terrific. It's been a great first try. We've learned a lot, continuing to learn, I think, and realizing that there are some things we need to kind of glitch out, and that's terrific. So I appreciate that we've had up to 48 people here in the venue. And then we've had a couple hundred more across the country. I was just saying to as Louise said, I'm Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. We're really, really pleased to be affiliated with this event. I spoke here 2 years ago. I was just into my job as the CEO, and I think I said, you know, cut me some slack. I don't really know what it is I'm doing yet, but 2 years later, here we are, and I don't think cities could be any more important than they are now. And as we've seen during COVID, the impact on urban environments has been extraordinary, and it's a really important, poignant, and pregnant time for us to learn a ton. And as I just said to Jen and Louise, I think this combination of online and in person and whatever these hybrid events are, I do not want to lose the perverse benefit that we've derived from being homebound and having to not be able to travel as much. I don't want us to lose that willingness to then interact in different kinds of ways. It's better for the planet. It's more equitable because more people can participate. It's not dependent on where you live or whether you have enough money to get an airline ticket. It's helping us understand that the world is about more than one time zone. And so I don't ever want us to go back to whatever we had, where it was only those of us that hung around in the same area. We should just continue to perfect more and more how we live in virtual connection and how we live in proximal connection, and that we can do that. Do you know what I mean? I think we can try to do both of these things or all of these things. So this afternoon, this last session is bringing us back into a discussion about place and what I call spatial urbanism, which is really about how the built environment affects who we are. It was interesting when Zita said this morning about objects can help us make meaning. And she was talking about design and products and all the things that they do at Fogo and how it shapes you. I think also our place helps us make meaning. And we're in a fabulous space here that some brilliant urban designer and architect and a bunch of engineers figured out how to do this. If they could raise those curtains, for those of you that aren't here with us, you would not know this, that behind these screens, behind these curtains, is a magnificent urban view. It's all glass back there. And this affects how we interact with one another and how we understand ourselves. It helps us make meaning, which is another reason why place matters and how places and spaces are designed. So we have folks on this session today who are going to ground us back into the spatial reality of how we make cities. And their bios will go into the Zoom channel. So if you're on Zoom, and I'm encouraged lots of people here, I don't know how many of you have been doing it as I have, but I've been logging on to Zoom in my seat as well, so I could see the chat, and I could also look around and see what's going on here. So detailed bios go on the chat. So we have Mitch Silver, and there's a long, extensive bio. Mitch, I can't see you yet, but I'm sure they're going to expose you in a second. I'll be able to see you. And you'll hear about Mitch. He's a planner and who I've known for a number of years. He and I were in New York City together, where he was the commissioner of planning. He's also worked around the country, around the US, on planning issues. He's particularly focused on these issues of how the spatial environment actually affects our capacity as urban dwellers. He's going to join us. So is Liz Ogbu, also a urbanist and a spatial justice activist. That's how her bio describes her, also trained in understanding how the physical world affects our experience of living together. And next after her will be Lezlie Lowe. Now, where is Lezlie? Because Leslie's here. Well, come on in. Do you want to stand there, or you want to sit here? I want you to come and join me up here, and I'll just sit and listen to theirs. And is this the sequence I'm going to go in? Is it going to be Mitchell and then Liz and then Lezlie, just as it's listed here? So Lezlie and I are going to hang out front, and we'll see the slides like everybody else does. Could I ask the Zoom folks to expose the screen so I can say hi to my pals here? So I can see Liz and Mitch. Hey, guys. There's Mitch. Hi, Mitchell. How are you? We can't hear you yet, but we know you're there. And hi, Liz.
I'm here.
Hello.
Good, now we can hear you both. That's good. Well, thanks for joining us, you two. And you're a little box. It's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know, have you guys done a hybrid event yet where there have been some people physical and some people online? You both have done
Yes.
hybrids.
And I'm leaving tonight to go to Nashville to do another hybrid.
Well, there you go. Well, that's great. Well, this is my first one where we get to have, I've got Lezlie here in the flesh, and then I've got you two on the screen. So we'll see how the panel works, and each of us has a different vantage, literally. Lezlie is here with me, and I love Leslie's bio because she says that let me just find it, Liz. I love the way you started it. You say, Lezlie, just a second. You say you're like, a failed urban planner. Yes, I like that. I used to say that I have a different phrase, which is even more worse than, because I didn't even train as an urban planner, but I'm a planner wannabe, or I'm a planner reject, I'm not sure. But anyway, you two are legitimate planners, Liz and Mitchell, and then Lezlie and I are the outsiders. We'll be the yin to your yang, as they say. So Mitchell, I'm gonna go to you first. And we'll hear what you have to say, and then we're going to do the same as the other formats. Each of them will take a good stab at it. We'll all be attentive to the screen, and then we'll go to you, Liz. So we'll go from one side of the country to the other, and then we'll come back here to the embodied experience here in Nova Scotia, and it'll be you after that, Lezlie. Okay, Mitchell, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my slides. First things first, important question. Can you see the slides? I see a thumbs up, so I'm just going to start. Well, thank you so much, Mary. It's so excited to be with you virtually, but this is the world we live in. I always like to start off by saying cities are about place, but more importantly, it's about people. And so I'm going to talk about a very critical element to cities, which most often gets forgotten, but through this presentation, you're going to get more appreciation about our public spaces. To me, great cities have density, but you can't have density without open space. They go together. And so I'm going to be sharing you, at least in New York, how we were able to create an equitable park system for all. First, I always like to start off by talking about the 21st century challenges. I have been doing this slide for probably 20 years and I'm always changing it. While there are elements on here that are key over the years, but the ones that I've been focused on and how open space can really play a role is the climate change, extreme weather events, but more recently our public health crisis, racial and social justice, divisive politics, and what is our post-COVID behavior. What I like about this list is I do believe planners and urbanists, we have to watch these trends like a stockbroker watches a market. Cities evolve over time, and we have to pay attention to these emerging trends so we can not only plan for place, but also plan for people. So since I'm now in the park space, from my perspective, what role can parks and public space play to deal with some of these emerging issues? And I'm so gratified as Parks Commissioner for the past 7 years, I just left the position about 2 months ago, that we were able to really look at our park system to help the public. How do we do that? Well, we looked very differently at parks in the 21st century. These are not just green spaces, but they're public spaces for people. And they're not just an amenity. It's essential city infrastructure. It's also the first line of defense for climate change. New York City is a coastal city, and we had to rethink all of our coastline, the 520 miles. And they're not just for physical well-being, but for mental health as well. I always like to remind those planners out there that AAPA, American Planning Association, has these amazing ethical principles and code of ethics. And I always lean into this because it inspires me to do the work that I do, that we shall serve the public interest with compassion. We shall seek social justice. And believe it or not, one of our aspirational principles, we shall urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose racial and social justice needs. So that gives me the armor and the courage I need to do the great work that I love to do. But when I start, right now, everyone's talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's not a campaign. I want to remind everyone that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not something you do, but it's who you are. And it's getting very popular today as we look to plan and to nurture and re-energize our cities. People look at it as a campaign, but it's who you are. So I'm now going to first start with equity. I have my own working definitions, which I'll share with you, but I like to keep it simple, not a long paragraph, because my goal is to implement these values. And the first one, equity, my definition is simple. It's fairness. Are we fair about how we plan our communities? Are we fair about how we distribute our resources? And in most cases, the answer is no. When I came to New York City and Mayor Bill de Blasio hired me, his first goal was he wanted me to create this equitable framework for the New York City park system. Well, how did we do that? Well, I decided to take a data-driven approach. And we looked at New York City to find out how much did New York City spend over the past 2 decades. And it turned out it was close to $6 billion. We added a lot more land that we acquired. And the previous mayor came up with this walk score. They wanted every New Yorker to be within a 10-minute walk to a park. Great metric. But when I became commissioner, it wasn't just about proximity, but it was also about quality. As you'll see in a second, I wouldn't let my child or grandchild step foot in some of these public spaces. So be careful when you use metric as you're building cities. It's more important you go a level deeper, not just focus on place, but also focus on people. So we decided not to poll anyone, not to reach out to elected officials. We used a data-driven approach to find out how many parks in the past 20 years received little to no investment. Remember that $6 billion, and it turned out there were 215 parks, hiding in plain sight. These are neighborhoods that were deprived for 2 decades. That's from kindergarten to college, saw no change in their public space. In New York City, our parks are our front yards, our backyards, our outdoor living rooms where people connect, where they thrive. And many neighborhoods were denied that privilege. It was not fair. And the mayor and I decided we had to do something about it. To the mayor's credit, he gave me funding to launch what's called the Community Parks Initiative. And we decided to recreate from the ground up, not replace them in kind, 67 of the 215 parks. And I have to tell you, the stories were powerful and transformative. And I'll never forget this one guy in Staten Island. When we went there to actually recreate the park in his neighborhood, he pulled me aside and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "No, we're really going to change this park." And he said, "I had to ask you that because I lived here all my life and I thought nobody cared. Thank you. Please deliver on your promise." So I'll give you an example. Here's the Robert Moses Era Playground in New York. This was in the walk score that people can go there and I assume roll around on the asphalt. But this is what people had to really have as their public space for well over 20 years. In fact, even further. I remember the council member and I were looking for one blade of grass and couldn't find one. So the question is, was this a parking lot or was it a park? And it seemed more like a parking lot. Now, this one's a little bit better because it has trees and a bench. So I assume you can go there, have picnic, have lunch, propose to someone. This, again, showed the example that this was in the walk score, but in my opinion, this is not a quality open space where somebody can thrive. So we decided to take a whole new design approach in the 21st century to give the public nice amenities, spray features. There are now over 700 in our parks, adult fitness equipment, so people of all ages can get healthy. We decided to have colorful, different, and vibrant amenities where young people can thrive. And then we wanted to break up the impervious surface, all the asphalt, to make sure that people had green spaces. In fact, in our public meetings, they said, give us horticulture, give us nature in our parks. And the good news is it didn't just provide that mental health benefit of being in green space, it also captured stormwater. So this is our new evolution, that parks are not just one-off, they serve multiple purposes. And then seating. We want to make sure that our seniors age gracefully. We quadruple the amount of seating in our parks because, as I said, these are spaces where people thrive. Whether you have a wheelchair, a stroller, you just want to gather, we want to make sure there's lots and lots of seating in all of our public spaces because we want people to feel welcome, to stay and enjoy. So I'm going to give an example of one of the projects we worked on. This is Garrison Park. We renamed it to Annenetti Park. That's in the South Bronx, right next to Community College. Here's the entrance, very foreboding. Here, one of the parks I said hadn't been invested in 20 years. Now, unlike the other asphalt parks and playgrounds, this one did have some vegetation in it, but unfortunately, it looked like this. Now, I want you to stop for a second and take a look of this space. This is the one I told you I would not let my child or grandchild step foot in this space. This is not fair. This broke my heart that this was in a neighborhood and been like that for decades. So I knew we had to do something. The good news is our designers came in. We thought very carefully at all ages, multi-generational. As I stated, this was near community college. Wanted to have a nice square where students can go and study, a splash pad, lots of seating for seniors. This is a schematic in 2 dimensions. This is what it looks like in 3 dimensions. And you see the college in the background. Now, this opened during COVID, and I can't wait when school opens up because those students didn't even know this park existed. We lowered the fence so you can see inside, and now this is a public space that had been neglected for 2 decades. Now they have a quality space. This is what fairness is about. This is what equity is about. Now, this next slide I'm going to share with you is somewhat moving. Another playground in Brooklyn on opening day, a little boy, about 8 years old, Hispanic, would not go into this park to celebrate the opening. Again, this was asphalt. We put in synthetic turf, a track. When we went to the little boy and asked him, why won't you come in? His response was, he didn't know how much it cost. He didn't know how much it cost because it looked that nice. He didn't see anything like this in his neighborhood, and something of this quality had to cost. This is the impact of this program that's allowing people to live in cities and thrive. And I can tell you that little boy and all the children in the neighborhood now will have a very different future, a healthier future, because we understood the importance of equity and planning for people. By the way, the little boy is on the track running around, and I can tell you, I'm sure he's been back many, many times. That is what it's like when you use the lens of equity. It's not something you do, it's who you are. And you look at your city with a very, very different heart and a very, very different lens. So I've stepped down in commissioner at the end of July. We were able to complete 60 of the 67 parks. We transformed 28 hectares of land that really did not exist before. We created friends groups so they can help nurture and care for these public spaces, and usership increased by 50%. Now, I want to talk about access, and to me, access is about removing barriers, physical, cultural, financial, and regulatory barriers. I believe in general that people may eat and sleep in their homes or apartments, but they live, they thrive in the public realm. So I want to make sure we take full advantage. As I mentioned, there's density, but the real action happens in the public realm, the open space. I believe that previous generations were consumers of goods. We love to buy stuff, but newer generations are consumers of experiences. So I believe we shouldn't just be designers and planners, but we need to be experience builders. And that's how, when I was at Parks, and even now as a consultant, I approach all the work that we do. And so we look at how we can reimagine the public space. You're looking at public land. This was underperforming asphalt in the center of Manhattan. And by putting up some chairs and tables, now it's an experience. We're reimagining the public realm, and we didn't have to acquire it. We owned it. We just thought differently about how we can use this land. And to me, this is so exciting. So many cities I go to say, we can't acquire new land. I said, do you have a street? Yes. Do you have a sidewalk? Yes. Then you can reimagine your public realm. You just have to think differently and not let Department of Public Works dominate the planning for your city. You need to have a team approach. So when we say about the public realm in New York City, parks represented 14% of the city, streets and sidewalks, 26%. Collectively, 40% of New York City was owned by the public. But the departments of transportation and those who manage transport dominated it by taking it for cars when I believe it should be given back to people. There's the same space that you saw earlier. It was concrete, now it's given back to the public. And I believe this is something we can do more and more. And COVID has now elevated this to the forefront. So I'll give you some examples of how we had to reimagine the public realm. In New York City, we love fences, but we call this a sidewalk. Yet Umstead said something very magical. He said the sidewalk adjacent to the park should be considered the outer park. And so when we had a park, we said, you know something, this is no longer a sidewalk, this is the outer park. This sidewalk, we now want to create a bioswale. And I'll tell you about this fence in a second because New York loves these fences. And there's a man with a dog a woman and a dog that's dying to get into the park, but there's a barrier. There's a barrier to open space. And so we knew it's something we had to change. This one always made me scratch my head. I assume the Parks Department thought the trees were going to run away at night, so they put a fence around it. It made no sense. So I wanted to have a conversation about how to deal with these barriers. And that entrance, you really have to bend down to get into this framed area. So you all know this was converted to a butterfly garden. We took the fence down, providing better access to the public by just reimagining what we do. When I introduced this concept about taking down fences or lowering fences, some New Yorkers got quite upset. You're going to make our spaces less safe. Really? Can you look halfway down the block and tell me what's going on? You can't. Fences obscure a sight line. For women and seniors in particular, they want to be able to see their surroundings to feel safe. And so in fact, fences and gates make you less safe. It was counterintuitive, but we wanted to recapture and provide better access, visual access to our public spaces, and we were able to do that. That launched what we call Parks Without Borders. It's a very simple program. It was part of our One NYC New York to plan a strong and just city. The program is simple. It's a design approach to look at the edges, the entrances, and the adjacent park spaces. And now what I mean by that is that we want to lower the fences so people now have better access. Put more street furniture on the sidewalk because parks close, but sidewalks never close. And to really start to provide better connection to the public. So I'm going to give an example in Queens of what this looks like, one I'm very, very proud of. We took a playground, we took a street, and then we took a schoolyard and merged them all together to create one larger public space. Once again, there's your Robert Moses type playground, super tall fence, asphalt inside, and even if you look at the sidewalk and pay close attention to those trees, and once again, there's a dog, and that man is not even looking into that public space. We wanted to create the experience of Parks Without Borders to bring the park experience out into the street. This is a schematic, and if you see where the trees are located, now they become this wonderful canopy where you have these nice benches. There is now a tree well and a garden around each one of the trees. Here is a closer look. I mentioned our parks are outdoor playgrounds, and this is so exciting. Removing the fence, providing better access to our public spaces, and reimagining the public realm to give it back to the public. There's that street that connects the schoolyard to the park. This is how it's been re-envisioned, and I'm so delighted that this is the end result. Here's a time of day when the park is closed, but guess what? The sidewalk is not closed, and it's fulfilling its intended purpose. People of all ages talking and sitting and enjoying themselves. Before this did not exist. And all we had to do is reimagine it, make a Parks Without a Border so that people can enjoy themselves. And so I'm so proud how this program is working. I'm now going to talk about inclusion, and I want to be very clear and explicit what I mean about inclusion. To me, inclusion means to be included and not excluded. It has to be for all people, and we have to avoid designing exclusive parks. What's the telltale sign? I want someone to be able to say, I feel welcome here. I belong here. To me, that is ultimately the test. I was shocked when I got to New York City and we literally had loitering signs in our parks. Now, I understand about loitering in front of private property, but we're talking about a park. Now, the word loitering means to stand or wait around idly by with no apparent purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we do in parks. You don't have a purpose, you just sit there. But if you're a white couple, look at those lovely people sitting on a park bench. Yet if there are 5 Black or brown teenagers, oh my goodness, they're loitering. That sign can be weaponized, and that's why we knew it had to change. Gratefully, in 2017, the City Council removed loitering as a park rule as part of the Criminal Justice Reform Act. I was so delighted because we want all to be welcome. In fact, the Parks Department leaned in even further, and we actually had an art project during COVID called the Yes Loitering Project. And we wanted to find out how we can investigate how teens, and let me tell you, teens are a huge target in public space, might feel excluded from or targeted in public spaces. If we want our spaces to be welcoming, that includes everyone, and teens, as I know, is part of all. Now, I show you this picture because this one was so powerful. This is in Detroit. This is Campus Marsh Park downtown, predominantly Black city. It's on the rise. And they had the audacity in their downtown to put a basketball court in their center city. Now, I have to tell you, most American cities will take down hoops, they'll take down basketball, but what they're saying, this city is on the rise, and young people, you're included, you matter. I was overwhelmed by seeing this because I hadn't seen this before in the center of your downtown. What message did it send to the young people that you matter, you're included in this city? I was so moved by this, and I hope more and more cities replicate it. By the way, that's called a creative court, and there have been no major incidences of crime. So it's all a perception when people see basketball as this threat. So I'm now going to close on my reflection on disruptions. It was a very difficult year last year between COVID and the whole Black Lives Matter movement. I was part of a running protest group. Here's one of our protests. And it was very difficult to go through these disruptions last year. But I want everyone to pay attention to this slide. There are natural reactions to stress and anxiety, and long-term stress and anxiety leads to trauma. Just look at the physical, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, and spiritual reactions to stress and anxiety. This is what your community was going through, your city, your workplace, your family, in some cases, you. And so I knew, as part of city building, there's something we can do as planners and park planners to address it. And to me, I was concerned because we're just talking about the stress and trauma from COVID and the racial and social unrest. What about generational trauma that people have been dealing with hundreds of years? And I wanted to make sure somehow I can play a role. Gratefully, I took this class from the Trauma Stewardship Institute, who even knew they existed, and started looking at what we can do to help our family, our colleagues, ourselves to be active, cultivate relationships, sleep, laugh, admire art. Many of the things that we're able to do in our cities, that if we think very differently, we can help alleviate some of the stress, anxiety, and trauma that we're dealing among our citizens. That's when I realized during COVID that our parks and public spaces became sanctuaries of sanity and in fact had the power to heal. And so I knew I had to work with staff to figure this out. But I also know, and I love my friend Jay Pitter, that parks also have the power to bring joy. This is my friend Vanessa. During COVID, I hadn't seen her for a while. As you can tell, she looks very joyful to see me, but meeting in parks brings that joy. And so I'm so excited that we had to think very differently about how we deliver our work. So right after the whole incident with George Floyd, we had a session with our staff to find out what we can do. What we're able to do is we wanted to find a space for healing, for reflection, for joy. And we took a park in Brooklyn and named it Juneteenth Grove, which is the day that supposedly that Blacks were freed from slavery. And so we painted 19 benches of Pan-African colors and then planted 19 trees to give that space to people in some measure to help them deal with some of the trauma, stress, and anxiety. Love this program. It is very popular. On Juneteenth last year, when it became official national holiday, this park was packed. And our staff even played a role in how they were able to paint some of the benches. And sorry, the phone is ringing, I can't get to it. And then I had the privilege of praying for one of the trees that I planted to acknowledge the importance of our ancestors and that those that will follow us. For me, this was coming full circle. It was my privilege to offer this and to others about creating these spaces. We went further and started to name a lot of our spaces after the Black experience to show that we belong in this city. Our stories need to be told. In total, we renamed 28 spaces, and now this is a place people can go to feel welcome and included in our city. I want to make sure I give a summary of what I believe the definitions are: equity, diversity, access, inclusion, equity, fairness, diversity, the value of different perspectives, access, removing barriers, and inclusion, being welcoming to all. With that, I just want to close by saying my goal is to create an equitable and inclusive park system that is accessible to all and has the power to heal and bring joy. Last point, I believe our parks and public spaces should now be part of our healthcare system. That's a result of COVID. And with that, I thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Mitch. We're going to hold questions till we're in the overall panel. Just to remind people that all the slides will be available. They'll post these. The sessions will be posted. You'll be able to look at them again and again. You'll be able to read the fine print when you have a chance to go back. Wonderful to hear from someone who's a steward of a system, who actually has been in roles in public service, managing a large system of parks, and as we know, all the equity considerations that were surfacing through the last 20 months as we realized that the system doesn't reach everybody, and how does that need to be changing. And as you can hear, how Mitchell's been trying in one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies that we know around park stewardship, how he was able to make change happen there. So great to have you, Mitchell. Really inspiring to see what you were able to do in New York and all the mischief that I know you're going to get back up to now that you're in private practice again. Liz, we're going to go to you now to hear. Liz is an architect, so also with a designer a perspective that Mitchell has. He's a planner. And so we're keen to hear from you, Liz, what your perspective is in terms of spatial justice, which I think is what you're going to talk to us about. So over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Always fun to see if that works. So hello, thank you, Mitchell, for the presentation and letting me know my slides worked. It's great to be with all of you, and I want to say greetings from Huichin, which is the unceded ancestral lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. It is more commonly known today as Oakland, California. So indeed, on the opposite side of the country from both Mitchell and all of you. And as I invoke the names of the Ohlone and of what they call this land, I also want to give a acknowledgement and call forth the memories of other Indigenous, Black, and non-white bodied people who have been part of making this place that I get to call home what it is, and who have persevered, dreamed, and built beautiful things, even in the midst of policies and the shaping of spaces that have seldom valued their stories or cherished their bodies enough. And I bring that forth in part because as someone who lives here, I feel that I have a responsibility to make sure that those stories and those bodies get cherished. And as someone who shapes space, that is also part of my responsibility. And in many ways, this acknowledgement connects to what I want to talk about today, because I feel, the theme of reinvention, I can't talk about reinvention without talking about what are we reinventing from. And I can't hold space for that from without talking about what are the emotional and physical acts of remembering that we need to do. And for me, remembering means opening the door to healing, which I am happy to say, time difference being what it is, I haven't tuned into all of the conference, but I've tuned in enough, and Mitchell mentioned it in his talk, this word, and that's exciting to me because I feel just, even a year and a half pre-COVID, it was rare to actually be in a built environment conference where this was the topic and people were talking about it consistently. So that makes me super excited. And healing for me is more than just a word or a concept. It really is a way of being that's been part of my life increasingly, not just in this pandemic, but for the last couple of years. But I do recognize that it feels like a complicated word right now in the midst of a global pandemic, but also in the midst of bitter political divisions. And when we see examples of harm and suffering constantly filling our news and social media feeds. And, after 18 months in particular, this pandemic, it can be really hard to navigate the pain and the discomfort that we feel. And there could be a desire to want to seek refuge from hearing about and seeing about the pain. And I just want us to note that we have to recognize that that in a way is the opposite of healing, as this quote by Dr. Kirkland Vaughn, I think so beautifully illustrates. One of the requirements of healing is mourning. And in order to mourn one's pain and suffering, the trauma itself has to be acknowledged. The trauma is not post, it is very much current. So in other words, to heal from pain, you must acknowledge the pain. And I am deeply aware that as we move towards what that means, and as we move towards thinking about how do we hold space for this discomfort, we have to know that it's not just about the right here and now. And the discomfort is not something that's going to disappear once we return to a state of quote unquote normal. to heal requires holding the expansiveness of the collective story that we are all in, as I believe this quote by the Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams so eloquently illustrates. And she said this actually early in the pandemic, but it still, I think, rings true today. The virus may not know any borders or boundaries, but it knows how to follow the wounds of injustice that are already in place. In other words, the need to heal is not new, nor are the things to heal from, as I think many of the speakers today have done a great job of illustrating. So for me, as I think about healing space and my role as a city builder, I ask the question of, how do we shape the built environment to wrestle with the arc of trauma? And I appreciate Mitchell's close to last slide, where he talked about the fact that like we are all experiencing trauma. And so it's important that we hold that. And until we wrestle with that, I don't know how we're going to work towards a liberated future free from it. And so I think as we think about how we shape our work and think about the things that we're navigating, for me, that question and how we deal with it is a really important one that must be the crux of how we move forward. So for me, Mary mentioned in her introduction of me that I talk a lot about spatial justice, and I'm an activist around it. And spatial justice for me is really what I consider my instrument of healing. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, spatial justice was actually coined by geographers many, many years ago, and it essentially means that justice has a geography, and that the equitable distribution of access, services, and outcomes should be a basic human right. And the truth is, we don't have spatial justice when in countless cities, not only around the US, but I imagine this is true of Canada and many countries around the world, it's possible to see differences in the neighborhoods where industrial uses ended up and not the gleaming office towers, or where you find insufficient bus routes versus the multi-million-dollar transit centers, or even where you find the harmful and decaying infrastructure versus the cutting-edge technologies, or where vacant lots proliferate and nice parks don't. And I bring both of the sort of where you see these things, because I think sometimes we focus a lot on the harm, but I think we can't separate it from like, there are people who are harmed and there are people who are benefiting. And I think that is important for us to hold both of those things as we talk about how we move forward. And it's really important to note that we can't just talk about this injustice in space without also talking about injustice across race and class. Because if I were to lay a demographic map over the like little physical space map, you would see that Indigenous, Black, Brown, and poor communities have disproportionately had less access to the good things. And that has been no accident. So for me, I believe that as long as we are separated or selectively harmed by space, we actually will not heal the wounds of injustice or create a more just society. And so for me, as I think about what it means to move as a spatial justice activist, and as someone who's really committed to racial and social justice, I have to hold these two things together. And as I reflect on where we might go with this conversation, I think how we hold healing in this moment is also a question of how we hold the truth of what must be healed. So, over the last 18 months, it's been impossible to escape from wrestling with the arc of the world, from, as Mitchell noted, the murders of George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and a list that sadly goes on far too long, to the heavy burden on low-income communities of color as we finally understood their work to be essential, to the high death toll of COVID in Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities, to the horrors long buried, like the tragedy at Kamloops. My slide just froze. That's not helpful. There we go. So to the horrors long buried, like the tragedy of the Kamloops Residential School, to protests that seem a testament to the denial of consideration of another's humanity, to watching the impact of our impact on this planet wreak devastation and take lives. The truth is, I could actually produce pages and pages of images with increasing levels of intimacy and pain, and I'm sure that you could too. And in the midst of all of this, I can't help but be struck by the fact that it feels like we've been here before. We seem locked in a cycle where we only know two states of time, the time of urgency, or rather emergency, and the time of complacency. In a time of urgency, we are we become overwhelmed almost with the awareness and the scale of the problem or problems. And we're eager for solutions that erase the pain of seeing and knowing. And I also feel it's important to be clear here that there are actually two types of urgency, that which is focused on repair and that which is focused on forgetting. And I think too often what we see is actually the urgency to forget. And that's the one that really exists within the frame of systems of oppression. It's about forgetting the fact that we feel uncomfortable or that we're in pain. And so urgency is, can we do just enough to get past that? And then once we do, let us slip into the time of complacency, which is all about not remembering that things aren't working or not what we think they should be. And so effectively, complacency becomes like that return to normal, which far too often ends up being business as usual, perhaps with a better Band-Aid. And so I think it's important that we hold that to lean into the return to any state of normal is to choose willful ignorance or to accept collateral harm and to say that that may be sad, but it is inevitable. We will have some people that happen to be homeless. We will have some people who happen to be killed. I don't understand how that is a satisfactory solution to any of us. I want us to hold that the path to healing can't be found if we're moving so fast or blindly in our urgency that we can't fully sit with the discomfort of what we and our systems have wrought, or so oblivious in our complacency that discomfort becomes invisible to those with enough privilege to see past it. For a while now, if you ask me how I'm doing, I would often say that I've been surviving the apocalypse. I mean it a little bit tongue in cheek, but also because of what the true meaning of the word apocalypse is. I know we often associate it with sci-fi, but apocalypse actually comes from the Greek word that means an uncovering or an unveiling, a revelation, if you will. And I feel at the start of the pandemic, it ushered in a revelation of sort. When we first went into lockdown, that announcement was cataclysmic for many. It ushered in a time in which we struggled to find stable ground. But it's important to recognize that for far too many, ground had long been uncertain. Millions living at the precipice of housing and food insecurity, neighborhoods of color having significantly greater vulnerability to poor health outcomes and early death, or Black men and women, myself included, knowing that occupying public space safely is far from a universal right. As it's important that we hold that none of this is new phenomena. What has changed is that the world suddenly got quiet enough for so many more of us to listen, to see, and to feel. And we've really been allowed to take stock of the power and trauma of systems that are working exactly as designed. And so I want to be explicit in that how I'm defining healing is reckoning with that designed system. And it's about being just as intentional about acknowledging, reckoning, and repairing systems of harm in our built environment as we have been complicit in supporting its existence. And so to hold healing at the center of what I do, for me, it's really about care, which I'm also happy to see was a term that came up repeatedly over the course of this day. So, I don't just see myself as a designer or architect. I understand that as someone who helps shape the built environment, I'm one of the caretakers of that environment. And to be a caretaker means that I understand that I have the responsibility to everything within the environment, to the many stories that are impacted by my actions. And to be accountable to that way of practice requires that I be in relationship with the communities that are the ultimate stewards of the places that I work in. And so with the remainder of the time that I have, I wanted to show you what this looks like on the ground. So one of the ways in which I hold care is by remembering to never assume that a project starts at point zero, and instead making time and space to acknowledge and listen to stories of harm and benefit that shape the context that I'm working in, such as here in East Palo Alto, which is a predominantly low-income community of color. It's worth noting that East Palo Alto is kind of like an oasis in Silicon Valley, but an oasis of poverty. So if you worked as a cleaner at Facebook, which happens to sit on the edge of the city, this is one of the few places in the region that you could afford to live in. But at the same time, it is also a site of resilience. A diverse community came together in the 70s and fought to incorporate the city on their own terms. And they've done so in spite of racialized policies that have actually impacted the resources that they have. And I would say a little side note, if you've never read The Color of Law, or if you have, East Palo Alto was actually featured in one of the case studies. When my colleagues and I first started working here a couple of years ago, we didn't begin the project with a community meeting or a pop-up installation, but instead actually spent many months engaged in listening sessions. And our conversations didn't start with, look at this beautiful thing that we want to build for you, but instead we said, we are here to listen to you and know what you want us to understand of your lives and of this place. And we also said that we were there to listen to the pain and acknowledge the harm that has been done to you. And I think that's really important, because sometimes if you're not the person who's caused the harm, it's sort of like, well, that has nothing to do with me, but it has everything to do with you, because we are the next in line in terms of the people who hold the power. And so therefore, whatever has been the harm of the past transfers onto us. And so it's important that we make space to listen to it. So what you see in this slide is actually a park that hadn't been conceived of prior to those conversations, but emerged explicitly from them once there was enough air for the expressions of pain that we heard in that meeting to give way to expressions of hope. And these parks have become much beloved. They were closed throughout COVID, and now people have been eagerly coming back to them. And so it's been really great to offer up that space. And what you see on this one is actually a second park that the residents explicitly asked for after the huge success of the first one. And for me, I love that it's a great park and looks wonderful, but one of the best things that came out of that was the fact that it was asked for by the community. And an important part of what I do on projects is, how can I create platforms of participatory power so that people can do that advocating that they may not have been able to do before. Important to this project was also the idea of not only co-creating the design, but co-creating the capacity for this park to be used. And so with the residents, we created things like walking club, fitness class, even an animal camp for kids. And I really think that part of that is to lay the groundwork to be able to get to the more thorny and emotional stuff that we need to do on this project, which has to do with redevelopment of housing. But really, you can't start doing that work unless you've done things to start to build a relationship. And this is one of the things that's allowed us to do that. I also hope care by remembering that shift from a place of harm to one of healing does not occur overnight or by something beautiful rising from the ground. And it actually requires creating an active state of reckoning that intersects with the design process. So here in the Bay Area, I've been working in the historic working class African-American neighborhood of Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. And here I've been working with a utility company, a team of designers and community groups for the past 8 years to transform a site that used to hold a power plant whose closure the community had fought for into a site of community benefit through interim activations, from job training workshops to an annual circus, to in the times of COVID, we've been doing a lot of food giveaways and also having a COVID testing access point. We also, a couple of years ago, created a beautiful new shoreline on the edge of the site. And it would be easy to rest our laurels on these dynamic events and spaces, which have become beloved by the community and which almost 30,000 people have engaged with over the time that we've been working here. But the way that we started this project and the moments of true reckoning that have happened since have really occurred through the spaces that we specifically created to hold ongoing conversations about pain and resilience, such as a listening booth and partnership with National Public Radio's StoryCorps project in the beginning of the project, and then more recently a partnership with the artist Chris Johnson and the Question Bridge project to do a year-long conversation that happened through events and art installations around identity, belonging, and space. And we've never tried to tie these conversations up in a neat bow, but instead understood that healing is a marathon, not a sprint. But healing can't occur if you don't offer up space, literally and figuratively, for the pain to come to light. And so that's what we've really tried to set forth in this project is, let us start the conversation. Finally, I hold care in expanding the design process to support opportunities for repair that look beyond the production of built form like housing or a park, and instead look to the active dreaming and practices of new ways to heal from the past and move past the yoke of systemic oppression, such as what's happening in Charlottesville, Virginia, with Friendship Court, which is a redevelopment project that I've been a part of for the past 5 years. Now, when you think of Charlottesville, you likely think of the murder of Heather Heyer and the racist incursion that happened in 2017. This project is actually located just 2 blocks south of the street in which Heather was killed. But I think it's important to know that the complication of race and space and the harm from that did not start in 2017. We could go far back to slavery, or even more recently to the 1960s, when urban renewal created concentrated zones of racialized poverty like Friendship Court that was built on the bones of historic African-American neighborhoods that were razed. For the past 5 years, this team that I've been working with has been engaged in a multi-phased effort in which redevelopment is used not as a destination, but the lever. And together with the residents, we've been creating a vision for an abolitionist housing model that centers the residents as the drivers of dictating what are the terms and conditions of a reparative community. And with their voices guiding us, we're doing things like reimagining programs that can occur that start to really advance the community and their dream for themselves, such as immigrant and refugee onboarding, or spaces like a culturally informed community garden that could help build an intentional community rooted in multicultural, multiracial, and multi-class belonging. Because, and really we've taken this expanded view in part because, as the executive director, Sunshine Mathone, has said, you know, if all we do is build better housing, we're just helping the poor to be poor better. And so for us, you got to look at this thing beyond just the built form. Care really means, like, how are we literally helping to seed the future that we're dreaming of, and what do we take upon ourselves as the responsibility to help get us there? I return back to this word healing, and I hope that my comments and stories have served as an invitation to think about what it would mean if we all saw ourselves as healers, caretakers of the built environment with an accountability to the care for everyone and everything within it. And I imagine, oops, clearly missed a slide. I imagine that if we started with healing as our starting point, that this theme of reinvention would hit different. It's not about a refresh or a tweak, but something much deeper. As I'm a nerd, so I couldn't help look up the definition of reinvention. And I was struck by the fact that it's about changing something so that it seems almost entirely new. And I want to just suggest, like, what if we actually made the thing new? What if we didn't build or tweak what we've been doing before, but actually said, if we were to do this right, what would we do? And so, you know, I think about what are actually the synonyms and antonyms of reinvention, which to me are much stronger, which talk about extinction and rebirth. And I can't help but wonder, if we pull our actions to thinking about how could we look at the systems that are dying, and how can we look at what we want to bring into being, this phrase from Zakiya Harris really hits home to that, where she talks about, we are hospicing the old world and midwifing the new. And I wonder if we could just use that as a frame of how we think about our actions. So with reinvention, and thinking explicitly on this term of not being small with the changes we want to make, but rather quite radical, how do we help the system that needs to die? And how do we bring the new thing that needs to come into being into the light, and really break from this urgency complacency loop? For my part, I think about my work and doubling down on what has been, and really centering things on the care for these people. And really together moving towards a direction of supporting the systems that we want to see, that create the future that we imagine. And for me, that's really rooted on healing. And in particular, how do we think about what we need to remember, who has been harmed and who has benefited, and that is top of mind as we start these conversations. Thinking about grieving, and how can we grieve and reckon with what has been, but also what must be repaired. And finally, returning to that idea of healing, how can we heal the wounds that we no longer want to carry with us, and continue to keep us from emerging into the future that we dream is possible. But it's important to move forth with all three of these things. And this is my definition of reinvention. It's about letting go of a way of being that's actually served to harm too many and benefit too few, and welcoming and practicing a way of being and building that celebrates the dignity and nurtures the thrivance of us all. And so with that, I thank you for listening to what I've got to say, and I'm eager to hear the next presenter and to have the conversation that follows.
Thanks, Liz. I hope you'll hang on, and then when we go into a conversation after with you and Mitchell, and also Lezlie, who's going to join us now, Lezlie Lowe, the failed urban planner, who's also a journalist, I see, is now going to speak here from Halifax. Do you want to talk here from the podium? Okay, so Lezlie Lowe.
Okay. Mask reveal. Hi, how's everybody doing? Good, you're hanging in. I'm so happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk in Halifax because you're my people. I'm from here in Halifax, and I'm gonna talk about toilets today, assuming my little clicker works. So my talk is called Stall Tactics, because my book is full of puns. Endless pun, oh, there we go. But there's a little blurb that goes along with it, and that blurb is, livability and walkability are touted goals for many cities, but planners and leaders often lose sight of one crucial component to make their cities friendlier: public bathrooms. So the first thing I want to do is actually tear apart that blurb, and particularly one word, and that word is friendlier. And I wrote that intentionally because this is supposed to be a catch-all for all of the things that public bathrooms do that make our cities better, but I'm aware that baked into the idea of friendlier makes it seem as if this is not a matter that is very important. It's simply like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if our city had public bathrooms? But this is a matter of deep equity, and I feel very passionately about it. I am the toilet woman. That is my thing. So to frame the conversation, I'm going to actually do something I do every time I give a talk, and I'm going to ask everybody in the audience to do a little mental checklist. So think about your public bathroom privilege. And the thing about public bathrooms, and this is what's drawn me into writing about public bathrooms and talking and thinking about public bathrooms, is we don't see them, right? We all have our little routes and paths and habits that we follow, and because we have that, we think everything's totally fine, because aren't we all here? We're all existing in the world. It's great, perfect. But actually, when we think that way, we're missing all these components of privilege. So the first one is, are you cisgender or are you transgender? Because we know that transgender individuals face verbal harassment and physical assault in bathrooms at a greater frequency than cisgendered individuals do. And I always add my little privilege checklist when I do this. I'm cisgendered, so I'm never gonna be questioned going into a bathroom that matches my gender. That's just not gonna happen. So I don't think about it, ever. But we need to think about that when we're thinking about making these spaces better. Caregiver. I had young kids. I still have kids. They're bigger, and they deal with their own shit now. Literally. But they used to not do that, and they used to need accompaniment, which is actually the whole reason I wrote this book, because I realized my entire relationship to the urban core changed the minute I had kids who were toilet training. I could no longer leave my house and do my route and go to my places. I always had to have bathroom radar on, and it just changed everything about public bathrooms for me and my thinking. So you need to think about elderly people that may be in your care, neuroatypical people who may be in your care, children who may be in your care, cognitively impaired individuals. Anybody you're caring for, it adds a bladder to your day or to those moments of your day, and you need to remember that. I'm white. And so I don't ever have to worry about being harassed racially for using a bathroom. And sometimes this is kind of forgotten or sensationalized, but this happened. This happens. The most, like the biggest kind of example we have of this is in 2018 in Philadelphia. Dante Robinson and Rashawn Nelson, two businessmen, were inside a Starbucks. They were waiting for a third man for a business meeting, and one of them used the bathroom, and they both ended up being arrested. And that incident, because it exploded, closed down Starbucks across the US for a single day. and racial sensitivity training happened, and it changed Starbucks because Starbucks decided at that point, okay, all of our bathrooms are going to be open to the public. We'll talk about that in a little bit. What is your health level? Do you have Crohn's or colitis or any other condition, temporary or permanent, that causes you the need for urgent bathroom access? So that can be fast bathroom access or frequent bathroom access. You need to remember that. And that impacts how many bathrooms there need to be in a city for people to use the city. Do you use a mobility device? Mobility device users need space to use the bathrooms, but I want to impress upon people that the way those spaces are designed change over time because mobility devices change over time. So I think mobility device use is one of those things where we're like, yes, we have a wheelchair stall, where it's like, that's the wheelchair stall. But that's not the full scope of it, right? And we need to reassess that space. There's a woman who I interviewed in the book that I wrote whose wheelchair doesn't always fit into the stalls anymore because some older design bathrooms, the stalls are not big enough. So we need to constantly rethink that, or else we're keeping people who use mobility devices of any kind out of the city. Are you middle class? This is one I think we don't think about enough, and I think it's about muffins. That's what it's about. It's about muffins. If I'm in a pinch and I have to use the bathroom and I can only use a bathroom as a customer, fine. I can whip out my phone and use Apple Pay to buy a muffin, but not everybody has that ability, and that can significantly affect who can use bathrooms in the city that are publicly available. Are you housed? So this is a kind of obvious one, and it's become very obvious in Halifax recently as well. It's a hot button topic, but people who are experiencing homelessness may be sleeping rough and have profound lack of bathroom access, or people can be couch surfing and they have lack of bathroom access for certain numbers of hours of the day, or they may be in the shelter system. Same thing applies. We need to think about bathroom access for all people in all stages of housing, right? What's the problem with women in bathrooms? The problem is women wait in line. Okay. Has anybody seen it? Women waiting in line for a bathroom? Okay. So I'm going to explain to you why women wait in line. It's actually very, very simple. Women empty their bladders more frequently than men. Women just empty their bladders more frequently than men. It's a biological fact. Women visit the bathroom for more reasons. So look around you, or think, if you're online and you're watching, think about the women in your life. 1/4 of all women of childbearing age are menstruating at any one time. That's another reason women will have to visit the bathroom. So women visit for more reasons. Women are also caregivers more frequently for the elderly or children. So women visit the bathrooms to help other people visit the bathroom. Oh, I forgot my clicky. Because the last one is 45 seconds to 90 seconds, and that's a time difference on average it takes women to urinate versus men. Women take about twice as long to urinate as it takes men, and that's not even including the fact that women go in and they have more complex clothing to remove, and also women, you know how the lock doesn't line up? It's like, you're trying to get the lock. It's just a more complex procedure to go into a stall than it is to have simple clothing that is a typical male attire and go up to a urinal. All that adds up to women need about 2 to 3 times the time men need in a bathroom. But what do we often see? For anybody who's here in Halifax, think of the Dal Arts Center. So, building built whenever it was built, I don't know, 60s. 2 bathrooms, equal square footage. On one side, you can fit 2 stalls and 4 urinals. On the other side, you can fit 3 stalls. So women need 2 to 3 times the provision, and that's code, right? That is code for new and extensively renovated buildings, but often we get half, hence lines. Okay. So I think about this endlessly, and it started because I wrote a piece in The Coast, which is the weekly paper in Halifax, which covers a lot of city issues way, way back when my kids were little, and then it turned into a book, and then the book came out in the UK, and there it is on that toilet. I'm going to talk briefly about how we got here. So, People often ask, how did this happen? Why did we get in this place? The way we got in this place was in the Victorian era, in Europe and England particularly, there was this deep desire for public provision of modern conveniences such as hygiene, right? There was a burgeoning population of people who were traveling for work, and so you saw bathhouses go in, and you saw public conveniences go in. This is the classic Victorian era public convenience. So down a flight of stairs, this is the Camden Town public loo. It's the women's, which is the subject of an entire chapter of my book because nobody wanted it there because it was for women, and women didn't need toilets in the early 1900s, obviously. Here, we didn't have that tradition. So what's happened in England and in Europe is those bathrooms have actually been closing because of decades of austerity budgets and because they're very difficult to retrofit to make them accessible for people who use mobility devices. But there's still some there. Here, we just never had that. Just was never a thing here. So we never put in public bathrooms, and what happened was our culture turned into this culture where we relied on publicly available bathrooms versus public bathrooms. So public bathrooms I define as free, on street, and ideally open 24 hours because they recognize that the need to use the bathroom exists 24 hours a day. Publicly available bathrooms are bathrooms that we all use and frequently love. Everybody in this room has used a bathroom in a Starbucks or a McDonald's or a Tim Hortons or any other kind of bathroom like that. Even, a quasi version of that is the library, which has fantastic bathroom facilities where I always know I can come in here to use the washroom. That's great. But mostly we rely on those publicly available bathrooms that are in private enterprises. The problem there is access is frequently restricted, as evidenced by this sign, which we've all come across when we had to pee. And we are denied benefits as a society when we rely on these bathrooms. So I'm going to talk about some of the benefits. So this is a public toilet in Lunenburg. Some of you may know this. It's a purpose-built building. It was built to be a public toilet. It fits in beautifully with the architecture of the street. It's right on I don't know the name of the street, but right by where the Blue Nose lives. It's a great space, very, very simple. Lunenburg actually did that, which was quite surprising at the time when they put that bathroom in, and then they're like, we're doubling down. And they put another bathroom in. This is like maybe a kilometer away. It's got a shower and 2 bathrooms. So Lunenburg is where it's at, as far as I'm concerned, for bathrooms. The reason Lunenburg did this is kind of the reason I want you to remember. It's tourism. Lunenburg is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a tourism town, and it understands that when people come to visit, they need to use the bathroom, and the more they're able to visit the bathroom, the more they can hang out, and the more money they can spend and a better time they can have. To understand this, all you need to do is think about the mall, right? You go to the mall, there's always a food court, and there's always banging bathrooms at the mall. That's not because they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. The mall has amazing bathrooms because the mall wants you to love being there and to stay and to spend more money. It's not rocket science. Okay. Oh yeah, I also wanted to talk about, it's not just about it being inviting, and it's not just about money, it's also about city use. So, when people leave their place of work and then they trip chain, they have to do multiple things along the way. They have to leave work and then go pick up the kids at daycare and then go to the butcher and get a pound of bacon for dinner and then go to the corner store and buy milk. They are out longer, and that's more reason to need bathrooms. Also, typically, women are trip chainers. Men are statistically more likely to get in a car and travel to their place of work, and then travel home. So women need that, just like women need public transit. Cristina Criado Perez wrote a great book called Invisible Women, which addresses a lot of these issues. I encourage you to read it. Okay, where are we? Okay. There's social benefits as well to public bathrooms. So Public bathrooms allow all citizens to be cared for in the city. This was so clear in COVID, right? Like, what happened during COVID? Everything shut down. All of the usual publicly available bathrooms that we relied on in the run of our day were no longer there. Things opened up. I did so many interviews with Ontario media outlets because of the different trajectory of the lockdown there. It's like they open all the parks. They're like, everybody come and get takeout and go to the parks. Didn't open the bathrooms. Didn't open the bathrooms. It's like, okay, well, you kind of didn't open the park. Like, thanks, but if you didn't open the park bathrooms, you didn't open the parks. It doesn't work that way. You must have bathrooms because no restaurants were allowing people in. There was just a profound lack of access. Huge problem. People really need to get out of, I loved what Liz said about that cycle of urgency and complacency. That's exactly what we're seeing with COVID. I fear is that, there were a lot of additional bathrooms put in Canadian cities, porta potties, because people were in desperate need, and now those are disappearing and we're kind of going back to where we were before. I think it's important that we don't do that. Also, what I've put up here is a photo of a Portland loo. And a Portland loo is a proprietary toilet design created by the city of Portland, Oregon, probably 2 decades ago now. And the Portland loo is a standalone, you can see it there, the little oblong thing, standalone toilet. It's off-grid. It's got a louvered bottom. So it's got quite a lot of ventilation, but it's not comfortable for sleeping, so nobody's gonna go in and sleep. They're big enough to fit a stroller or a bike intentionally, and I'll talk about that in a bit. They purposely put the hand wash station on the outside so that people can move through more quickly. You use the bathroom, then you go out and wash your hands, or if you're walking down the street and you wanna wash your hands, you can wash your hands on the outside. There's also potable water. So it's really not just a bathroom, it's a bathroom and this resource for hand hygiene and resource for drinking water. Really, really important, works very well. So bathrooms I think of them as equity in action, right? When we put bathrooms in our communities, what we're doing is telling all people, bathrooms that work, telling all people that they belong in a place, that they have ownership of a place, because otherwise people can't use the place the way they want to use it. So, given all this friendliness, why do cities not embrace public toilets? And they really don't. Portland, Oregon does. Yeah, that's the only city I'm willing to say embraces. Portland, Oregon embraces public toilets. The reason is toilets are super complex. I'm not going to pretend toilets are not complex, and they're perceived to be costly. I'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah. The headline here is they are complex and they're not cheap. And what happens because toilets are complex and toilets are not cheap is cities do public toilets poorly on the balance. So they don't take different users' needs into account when they build public toilets. And I always think of this as the mistake of thinking that a bathroom is a room with a toilet and a sink. That's not what a bathroom is. A bathroom is a highly complex space that needs to be well designed and needs a lot of thought to go into it to work well. Or it's not a bathroom. Mitchell earlier showed you those photos of the things like, is it a parking lot or is it a park? Like, what is this? This is allegedly a park, but it's not working as a park. That's like a lot of bathrooms. It's like, technically that's a bathroom, but this thing is not functioning as a bathroom. It's not working as a bathroom at all. Cities also put in too few, and that ties into this idea of health and need. And so kids have urgent need, people who have Crohn's colitis or other conditions have urgent need. We need more public bathrooms. We also need more signage. Lisa and I were talking about this, like this idea of you have a sign that says bathroom 150 meters. That's really important, really, really important, because when you have to go, you need to know how far it is. We can talk a little bit more about charging for bathrooms later if you want to, but I'll skip over that for now. Bad idea. This is the gist of it. Okay. Or cities do not do them at all. This is an empty cage on the mainland common. I love it. Like, oh, come on, man. Even when there is a little porta potty in there, it's all locked up. You're not allowed to use it. I know. I know. Oh dear. So cities don't want to, this is funny and that's why I put it up there. I think this was actually an individual group that paid for this porta potty, but they put a lot of money in, like they poured a concrete pad for it. Okay, so cities don't want to deal with identity politics, right? They don't want to have to deal with thinking through all these different angles, all that toilet privilege I asked you to work through before. That's a lot to deal with. And when they screw it up, which is very easy to do if you don't do a really thorough process, then they're criticized for screwing up what is inevitably a multi-$100,000 project. And people hate, the public hates paying for public toilets, bizarrely, right? Because always like, whatever, I could put that in. You know, it's like this complete lack of understanding of like, this is a public amenity that must be infrastructurally sound. When we think about automated public toilets, which some of you, I wonder if I have which some of you may have seen, not the Portland Loo, which is off-grid, but to a certain extent the Portland Loo, but the toilets where you like put a quarter in and then the robot toilet door opens and you go in and then when you leave it closes and it does a self-cleaning cycle like a dishwasher. Those are reasonably common in the US and they're like little houses, right? Because they have hydro and sewer and electricity and they have to be put in on a city street. This is not an inexpensive project. People don't like that. There's so many clickbaity headlines about like, whatever, city X paid $200,000 or $500,000 for this toilet. It's like the ultimate ridiculous waste of money. And yet, here we all are needing toilets 6 to 8 times a day for the average healthy person. So there you go. Cities don't want to deal with citing them. It's very challenging to cite toilets. And the reason I think it's challenging to cite toilets is because people have this idea of toilets as dirty and gross and problematic. And I will say 2 things about that. I think that's a really neurotic way to look at toilets, and it comes from that tradition I talked about, you know, we don't see toilets on the street here as you might in England or other places in Europe, so they're just not part of the everyday landscape. And we also are taught to think of them as like places where it's just gross. Concession. Some toilets are disgusting. They are gross. You know why? Because they're not being treated as toilets. They're being plunked down, the capital investment is going in, and then they're being ignored. So that's the same as, you know, like you're not putting in a toilet there. You're putting in a place that is for people to do whatever they're going to do in that space that is not using a toilet. That's a really important thing. We need to maintain our toilets really well, and they need to work for everybody. Everybody should be able to use that space. Everybody should feel comfortable going in there, and we need to really reinforce that to make sure everybody uses the space. Okay, how to fix it? I probably have a minute left, so no problem. Walk the talk. So cities talk so much about walkability and livability and being cycling friendly and all of these positive adjectives or aspirational adjectives, and yet do not put in public toilets. Don't even talk to me about being a cycling friendly city if you're not going to put in public toilets, because you don't want to be a cycling friendly city. You don't want people to commute 30 minutes from Bedford if you're not going to have somewhere that there's a public toilet along the way, or for somebody to stop and grab a drink of water or whatever. There's a whole bunch of other pieces to the puzzle that need to go into place. Whenever I see that a new strategy has come out from a city, particularly aging in place strategies, I always do a control find. I open the strategy, open the PDF, do a control find for like public bathroom, public toilet, all those different words. Very frequently, nothing comes up. So it's just completely forgotten. And I actually asked somebody once who was in charge of an aging in place strategy for the city of Toronto. And she said, well, nobody brought it up at the public consultation. And so I said, well, did you ask people? Because frequently, because we have these neuroses around public toilets, people do not sit there and say, like, I would like a toilet. People just don't say that, right? They need to be asked, would you like this? Not only those leading questions, but there has to be a different kind of way to attack it, like to crack that nut when you're talking about public toilets. Finally, show me the line item. And it's the same thing, right? It's like if you're gonna talk about wanting people to be out and about in your city, to use your city, to feel comfortable in the city, you're talking about a city of inclusion, then it costs money. And if you don't wanna pay that money, okay. But don't say you want something that you're not willing to put a budget line item below, right? You can't have one without the other. We have to have both. That feels like a bit of a downer. But there's my contact info, or you can just Google me, and there's my kids. So I added them at the end because it's a cleanser. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Okay, I hope this will work, as it isn't yet, but I'm assuming it will. I hope that Liz and Mitch will come back and join us. And we'll take Leslie's kids off the screen and put Mitch and Liz on the screen with us. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Great to have you. And while we're waiting for Mitchell and Liz to suddenly appear on the screen, I'll just riff off Mitch, who said, in a park, you need a place to sit. And you also need a place
To pee.
You're less poetic than I was going to be. I was trying to rhyme.
Oh.
But nobody got it, apparently.
No, nobody got it.
Nobody got it. But I think that a question came from the floor. I still can't see anybody here, Mike, so are you going to help me see Liz and Mitchell? Hello. That's what I was requesting. Thanks. Hi, gang. I think it's a very poignant way to end the session there. We're going to take a little bit of time just to talk amongst us now. And I just want to salute the people that are here because they're close to a cocktail hour here in Halifax, gang. So we're standing between them, not only between them and a break at the loo, but also a break at the bar. So, but let's take 15 minutes or so and just have a chat. I think one of the reasons it's interesting to have you at the end here and to give us such a concrete example is that I think a lot of what we've been seeing over the last couple of months, certainly, in our public spaces has not been pretty. It's been, if you think of what's going on with encampment and what's been happening, what's been visibly happening, we've been seeing public life and a different kind of public life manifesting, including where can people defecate. And so I think it's important to ground the conversation in the reality that if you don't have a place to shelter, and if you are inadequately housed, or if the system itself is not giving you some options or providing you with the care that a number of people, Liz reinforced and that Gabriella talked about this morning in terms of what they're doing in Columbia, if you are outside of those systems, you're kind of screwed, and it shows up in our parks. So I might just go to you, Mitchell, first, and just ask you a bit about the whole phenomenon that we have seen more and more and more through the last 2 summers, or I shouldn't just say summers because the climates are different, but that we've seen through the pandemic of more people opting to not go into shelters, but to actually live in public space. And I'd be interested in both you and Liz commenting on that, and then we'll hear what Lezlie says. So you first, Mitch, on
Let me quickly say 2 things. First, you're right, we have seen a change. New York City is unique. We have very little tolerance for encampments, but at the same time, we have an army of social service providers and parks and police that go out and speak to the homeless. Nobody can sleep in our parks overnight, whether you're housed or unhoused. So we're very diligent, both in our parks or sidewalks, that we do a lot of outreach. We recognize and know the population. And so that's the one point. The other point, which really struck me and had to really take a step back and think differently about the unhoused, you probably know Morningside Park, an Olmsted design park in northern Manhattan. We had a group of the Garden Club paid money to restore a waterfall. It's right under Columbia University. And it was a great opening day. As we're leaving, the head of the Garden Club approached me and she had 33 cents in her hand. And I said, where are you giving me the 33 cents? She said, that homeless individual over there donated the money because he wants to help maintain this park, because this is where he comes every day to feel alive. Now, that stopped me in my tracks because it gave me a perspective that parks are for all. That's why I said earlier, we said teens, but parks are for all. And if a person does not have a home, cannot come to a park, where can they go? Now, we want everyone to behave and follow the rules in parks, but it made me think very differently. And I think New York City has it right to have the outreach services, to find housing, find other mental health resources people need is the right thing to do. But we're gonna have to step out of our normal roles and think differently about how to help those that are unhoused. But we do not allow people to stay there overnight. And again, we have the resources to help. So that's my take, but there's no question we've seen more and more people in general in our parks, because during COVID, it was the only place that was open. Your office, your gym, your party venue, along from the normal things people do in parks. So we just have to ride this wave and realize, as I said, parks are part of our healthcare system, but they're also open for all. And homeless and teens and everyone, people of color, are part of all.
I just want to reply, though, that and I don't, Liz, I'm going to come to you next, but there would be advocates here in this country, Mitchell, that would not be comfortable at all with your description of an army of police and other workers coming to talk to the homeless. That would not go over well. Certainly earlier in the day, we've had discussions of Oppenheimer Park in Vancouver, where they did a decampment exercise, which was not, I would not say it was a military operation. In Toronto, they had a very ugly experience where it was militarized and it was not received well. And I think those actual approaches are not looked at fondly at all in Canadian cities. Liz, let's just hear from you if we could. And then I'm interested if anybody here in the audience wants to offer on encampments or anybody in the chat. Go ahead, Liz, you first.
Sure. So, I mean, here in the Bay Area, as I don't know if you've heard, San Francisco in particular has a wackadoodle housing market. It has only slowed slightly during the pandemic. So for the last couple of years, we've been seeing an explosion in tent cities and encampments in the number of folks who are unhoused. And it was already a huge discussion point pre-COVID. And so one of the projects that I'm working on is in San Francisco in a neighborhood called the Tenderloin. I heard at least one other speaker mention it earlier today. That neighborhood had a disproportionate number of San Francisco's unhoused population pre-pandemic. And we had already been working with a group to talk about what is a way to sort of transform the streetscape in a way that wasn't actually about displacing that unhoused population, but how do we create more humane conditions on the street so that everybody can benefit? Then what happened once COVID hit was like the numbers of unhoused folks exploded tremendously in that neighborhood, creating, the conditions were already rough. There's also a huge drug using population there. So that made conditions on the street really poor. And also for there are a lot of kids who live in that neighborhood, live in some of the residential housing. They weren't able to go out into the street. And so you can imagine a time where COVID, where you can't go to many places anyway, and then you can't even go out onto the street. And so it hit real crisis levels. And so the streetscape project that had been on hold initially, all of a sudden got a new impetus to move forward because the conditions on the street had gotten so bad that we hit the sort of emergency level that I talked about. And so with that, we were able to enact several different new sort of mini parklets, but like actually geared at the population that lived there. And for me, what is really interesting is prior to the pandemic, we were struggling to get all the right people from the city to the table, getting the money to be able to enact all of these things. And then once the pandemic hit, the need became so urgent that folks found the money, folks found the way to like blast through policies. And so for me, one of the questions is, and I think I heard this mentioned earlier today too, that we're really good at responding when things hit that emergency crisis condition that we cannot look away from. And I think the question is, like, conditions were poor pre-pandemic. And I think that is true of many of these unhoused situations that we go into. And so how do we get the urgency to feel like it's not just in this short-term period of time? We should never be okay with the situation to begin with. And how do we take that same sort of impetus to be creative with solutions and apply it in the quote unquote normal times, or the things that come after this sort of pandemic emergency? Because I don't think anyone should be okay with the fact that there is a single person who is not living in the conditions that they want to live in.
Right. Well, and I mean, I guess that's interesting for us now as we look at this moment. Are we going to be able to sustain a commitment to doing something differently when the urgency starts to feel as if it's waning a bit? So I want to just pose to all three of you as people engaged in urban design, do you think now could be the moment where we could make some permanent changes? Do you think that people are more receptive? Let me start back with you, Liz, as the designer, then I'm going to go to Lezlie and then to you, Mitch. Go ahead. Are there specific, do you think they're listening to you now in a way that they weren't?
I do. I think, in a weird way, the fact that, I would say there's different spectrums in how painful the pandemic was for all of us, depending on the level of privilege you have. But I think everybody got impacted in some way because of the pandemic. And so for me, that universality is something that I'm just going to keep on poking on as like people want to return back to normal. I'm like, but do you remember how it felt when this was uncertain, when that was uncertain? Because that's something that these communities that I work with are dealing with every day. So I think some of it is about those of us who were already committed to this work, continuing to hold people accountable to that feeling. There's something about how intimate that felt that I think is helpful in leveraging people to come to the table. And then I also think, some of the things that we'd never tried before, but, when we seemed like we were in a crisis stage, it was like, all right, let's give it a try. And I think the fact that some of that stuff worked can be a way to continue to force people to be accountable to the fact that but we did do that and that worked and this condition is still existing. So how do we continue to make sure that people aren't afraid of taking that risk?
Yeah, there's something about urgency, that somehow the urgency was I wonder if people felt they had more political cover. I don't know. Oh, well, I can approve of, maybe we got emboldened. There's a question in the chat for you, Lezlie, from Susan Fletcher, wondering if part of it is that in the UK, for instance, they call them toilets. So that it's pretty explicit, I need a toilet, as opposed to a washroom or a ladies' room, which only Canadians really use, more, quite calmer. Yeah. So back to the urgency piece, is there a way for you to leverage, do you think now, and keep the urgency? Or will there just be new urgency, maybe because now climate will be the emergency, I don't know.
Yeah, I was so hopeful with COVID. That sounds perverse, but
no, I understand
yeah.
That. Go ahead.
That, for the first time, people who had incredible amounts of toilet privilege were suddenly feeling what it was like to not have anywhere to go, and very basic example, a neighbor of mine takes a long walk with her 2 dogs every Sunday morning, and she said, oh, I can't go on a long dog walk anymore because the, Citadel Community Center bathroom is no longer available for me to stop at on my way. It's like, people were feeling that. I think if people can harness that feeling, then we may have some political capital to move forward. I think we could do that. But the other thing is, COVID has presented this situation where public health has always done this, right? Talked about this idea of, we all do this for the good of everybody. And we really felt that during COVID. When we talk about open defecation specifically, this is not like, oh, it's too bad that that's happening. This is a public health emergency. There's hepatitis A outbreaks happening because there's open defecation happening in all of our cities.
But same with, that's what harm reduction eventually did too, is it said we're going to give people a safe place to be able to get the drug they're needing rather than put them on the street where they're going to discard it in an unsafe way. So is it a harm reduction approach to just bodily functions?
To health, yeah.
Right. And it's interesting for all of us to be thinking a bit about this, and I don't know whether any of you are doing this in your sort of daily journaling, but as we come through into the new era, whatever the heck that is, are there half a dozen things that you feel that you're going to commit to that you feel should never go back? We should all, these are the 6 things or 5 things that you're going to put pressure on yourselves to respect and decision makers to respect. Mitchell, what would yours be as you go into this next era? And now that you're back into private consulting, what are your priorities?
Well, for one, clearly you go from working for the public sector to private clients, but also some of our clients will be in the public sector. What I've discovered in COVID is that what we as urban planners and designers have been pushing for years are now finally happening as a reality, reimagining the public realm. I mean, who knew that we would take parking spots and have parklets so that now people could eat outdoors or at least have a little more green on the street. Closing streets, play streets, shared streets. We're now in New York City, for example, are now making 100 miles of close of these shared streets permanent. And will lose over 8,000 parking spaces because they understand the importance of the public realm. I expect that will happen both in the US, but also in Canada, as people really need those outdoor public spaces. That's one. Number two, not related to COVID, but this whole issue about the civil and social unrest, really taking a hard look at the naming of our spaces and who we recognize and memorialize in our public spaces. I'd mentioned a couple. We started with the Black experience. Now we're moving on to Indigenous population, LGBTQ. We want to make sure that our parks reflect the diversity of our city. So there's the deep examination about who are parks named after, and we're at this effort to make sure we correct past wrongs. The other thing I've noticed is that people really now have an appreciation for parks. During COVID, they realized it was, as I said, the sanctuary of sanity. We have volunteers coming out more than ever to make sure that these spaces are cherished, because at the same time during COVID, when we saw a record number of people come into our parks, because of the economy, we had to reduce our headcount by 2,700. It was kind of a perfect storm. And while our parks became more popular and crowded, also so did the litter. So people are now respecting parks and see the value more and more. And to me, that I believe going forward is one of the benefits. Park workers seeing it as essential, parks being valued in a very different way, reimagining the public realm, and more importantly, looking at the names to make sure it represents all of us and not just those who are privileged.
Mitch, do you think, there's a question in the chat from Penny Kuhn, asking about stewardship, basically.
Yes.
Who are stewards? And is there, do you think, an opportunity to carve up new relationships where the municipality, I want to talk to you someday about it, you keep saying the city, the city, the city, and I think you mean the municipality. But is there a new way for municipalities to enter into partnerships, maybe with park, friends of park organizations, or business improvement districts? So can the stewardship be shared, Mitch? Can it not all fall to the municipality? But what about the rest of us?
Yes. Now, New York City is unique, but I certainly want people to look at the example of New York. We get about 60,000 volunteer hours a year. We have well over 600 groups, friends groups. But we also have business improvement districts. Bryant Park is run by a business improvement district, the Great Park right in Midtown. We have conservancies like Central Park, Prospect Park, and the High Line. But we have all these friends groups. In New York, because your parks are so personal, we have our volunteers coming out. And like I said, we have a whole organization called Partnership for Parks that will work with neighborhood groups. But now we have these service days where we have major companies are coming out to help clean our parks. So I encourage other cities to do it. Some cities claim that their employees are concerned about their union jobs being taken away. These are value added. It's raking leaves. It's nothing that's going to take any job, but people care for public spaces. And it's a huge benefit, not only to getting outdoors. Kids love planting trees. There's a great way of engaging the community to be outdoors, to get healthy, but also to get businesses, business improvement districts, and the local community to get active. So there are a lot of examples out there, but I think New York City has the best. And we have a whole entity called Partnership for Parks that helps establish those relationships neighborhood by neighborhood.
Mitch, we had about 10 seconds where we lost you, so I just want to make sure an alien didn't take over your body. It still looks like you, I think. So as we move forward into this new era, whatever the hell that's going to be, and anybody here who has a comment or a question, you've been so good and well behaved. Yes, Lisa. I'm going to repeat the question so the Zoomers can hear it. Go ahead, Lisa. Okay, let me just relay that. Concern about if we delegate too much to community groups and to non-governmental sources, then are we going to find ourselves where the wealthy neighborhoods have well-organized support groups and the neighborhoods that don't have the same amount of wealth won't have the same kind of capacity? Is there a concern that there's an equity implication if we have different kinds of partnerships? Liz, maybe do you want to answer that first, and then I'll go to Mitch.
Sure. I mean, I do think, time is an equity issue, and there's definitely, I sort of joke, not joke on my meetings that I rarely start off with a community meeting on projects, because I think community meetings, as they are traditionally done, often reward people who are time rich, not those who are time poor, who may care about their community but don't have the capacity to, after working a shift job, to show up at a hall to talk about a project that may not see the light of day for years. And so I think I think what we should be asking is not like, oh, creating these stewardship mechanisms, therefore create these unequal situations, but like, how do we give people the possibility of being a steward? And so how do we design systems with support to enable them to be able to do that? So the Friendship Court project that I mentioned, we basically have an advisory committee that we created that are co-decision makers right alongside the nonprofit for every major decision of the development. We pay them, we figure out ways to make sure that if they can't come to a meeting because they have conflicts, how do we get that information from them? How do we allow other residents to be able to participate in the time that they have? What support do they need to be able to participate? So I think it's not so much about not having these groups, but sort of what does the system need to provide to enable folks who may have other demands on their time to be able to participate at an equitable level.
Right. Anything to add, Mitch?
Yeah, and as I said earlier, equity is not just something you do, it's who you are. So when I led the Parks Agency, we made sure everything was about fairness. Someone asked a question earlier about how do we care for our parks. We had service level agreements, we had inspectors going out. There was very quick intervention. And if we needed to pay more attention to pick the particular park, we had outreach coordinators that would go out to the local neighborhood and make sure that we had those stewards that would come in and help. We had It's My Park Day that's very well publicized. So if fairness is your operating principle and you believe it in your heart, then to me, you avoid the situation where you have a rich conservancy giving money to improve the park. When I was commissioner, we actually had some of the more affluent conservancies assist us with our equity initiative, and it worked quite well. So you have to start with that frame of mind. Everything else starts to fall in place. But we look very carefully at those communities that have some and those that don't. Either the city will put in the capital resources and staff resources, but we also look for other partners to make sure our entire system is equitable, because every neighborhood deserves a quality park.
I'm going to take one more question from the floor, and then we're going to wrap. Go ahead.
Okay, quick solution to the toilet problem. Make it part of the Halifax water system.
Point from the floor is that one of the ways to get toilets into the system is make it part of the water system. So it's on your tax bill, you install the water sewage system, and that includes toilets. What do you think of that idea?
I mean, yeah, we can try anything. I think what you're going to run into is this idea that, no, too costly. Like, the ditch tax went on. People really, really had a problem with the ditch tax. And when you add that on, people just don't want to pay for public toilets because they don't see the need for them. But yeah, I mean, let's go for it, sure.
Just to put a lot more women in charge of these decisions in municipal governments, and suddenly washrooms will appear because they're the ones, as we know, hauling around trying to find bathrooms for themselves and their kids. Liz and Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us online, and everybody on Zoom, thanks for hanging in. Thanks to the Halifax audience for being here with Lezlie and me for the last session. So appreciative to have you hang in. You've got great stamina. I just want to acknowledge that we have really enjoyed this at the Canadian Urban Institute, an association with Develop Nova Scotia, over several months as we've been contributing to the forming of the Art of City Building. I've watched this conference since I was in New York and watched it evolve over the period of time, and Paul and TJ and Karash's leadership and Tara and you. And I just want to acknowledge that really the country here in Canada, we have lots of Americans participating. Thank you, US Americans and Gabriella from Europe. But Canada is so appreciative of the leadership that Halifax has shown and continues to show, and that you shared the art of city building beyond your own region, but to the country. And that's what CUI is about, is building the connective tissue of city builders coast to coast to coast. And we are starting this week with one of our larger programs, with today, carrying on under Lisa's leadership, CUI Local, which is a deep dive that we do in communities. We've been in Edmonton, in Calgary, in Windsor. We're happy to be here in Halifax this week. Next month, we're in Victoria. We hope to do as many cities as we can to be able to really identify what's working, what's not, and what's next in those cities so that we can build the capacity to build better cities in Canada and around the world by learning from each other, peer to peer. And you heard many, many peers here sharing their experience over the day. You really do win a Stamina Award. There's the CUI local piece, which I asked them to put up. Thank you. We're here for the whole week. Lots of opportunities to interact with us. Go to canurb.org or talk to Jen Angel because she always knows where we are, or Louisa Dongo, who's helping us pull it together. Jay Pitter, for instance, is flying in tonight to be part of that discussion. We have colleagues that are coming in to talk about our Restore the Core work that Paul has been very supportive of, the future of downtowns in Canada, all of which are struggling, and also, of course, bringing back our main streets. Very, very important as we build the recovery of Canada from the ground up. So thanks for joining us. Thanks for another AOCB success. Really glad to be here, and have a good evening.